Rumors have been spreading. The townsfolk have been dreading. Whispers of an eldritch horror lurking in the dark. A late night lonely walking. Someone saw the creature stalking. He stood there frozen, balking, then took the long way round the stones. And all our days are haunted. The clinician, he though vaunted, was vexed and surely daunted o'er this wasting unto death. First the farmer's wife, then it took the proctor's life. The last words uttered rife were that the dead had come for them. At length the group assembled, clutching lanterns, hands that trembled. Armed with stakes and lances, they descended on the tombs. The fallen leaves were rustling, in the dead of night a bustling. The coffin lid a jostling open, they gazed into its depths. Within the white was keeping, as if it had been sleeping, though from its mouth was seeping gouts of fresh vermilion blood. They stabbed and then they slashed, and burned its heart to ash. Though it was a dreadful task, the dead would never come again. Welcome to The Hidden Passage, your gateway to the unknown, a podcast where we explore all things paranormal through the lens of culture and the occult. The vampire is one of the most prolific supernatural entities known to man. It has been recorded in the mythology of some of the earliest civilizations, and in the folklore of virtually every culture. Throughout the Middle Ages, its presence was felt quite literally, to which the many scores of recorded accounts of their grisly activities are a testament. From the literary renaissance of the 19th century continuing into modern day, saturating the horror genres of both movies and TV, the vampire is very much still a part of the cultural zeitgeist. In this episode, we will examine what the true nature of this phenomenon is that struck so much fear into the hearts of people worldwide, and caused them to take drastic and gruesome measures against it. Of course, like most things we have examined thus far, the belief in vampires is now considered to be nothing more than a product of ignorant superstitions, and the idea is kept alive for the purposes of mere entertainment, or the musings of staid anthropologists. But for much of history, the vampire was an all too real and perhaps the most formidable member of the coterie of malevolent beings thought to roam the night, stalking and preying upon unsuspecting persons in their sleep. For the purposes of our study, we will examine the vampire as a specific creature, as well as vampirism as a mode of being, which describes the means by which an organism acquires its food and energy requirements, similar to zoological categorizations such as carnivore or herbivore. From this perspective, the vampire would be considered a parasite. This is an organism which derives nutrients from another organism at the expense of its host. The term vampire is a subset of this, referring specifically to the drinking of blood. So in this sense, a vampire can be a range of entities, both human and non-human, which engage in the act of vampirism. In its most common form, Webster International Dictionary defines a vampire as, quote, a blood-sucking ghost or reanimated body of a dead person. The types of people who become vampires in death are further elaborated in Whitney's Century Dictionary, which states, quote, "Dead wizards, werewolves, heretics, and other outcasts become vampires, as do the illegitimate offspring of parents themselves illegitimate, and anyone killed by a vampire." The vampire was thought to be created through the preternatural transformation of a human being at the time of death, caused by various forms of degradation. The most typical examples of this were that a person was cursed or met a particularly violent end. The vampire would then stalk the world of the living, either with its physical body or by sending its spirit out in the form of a ghost-like specter. While typically vampires are considered to be undead creations, there are several examples of living vampires, witches who were said to practice black magic, having gained the ability to siphon off their victims' life force. Others were thought to be demonic spirits, which took up residence in human cadavers once the person's soul had left the body. Further still are examples of vampiric beings that were altogether non-human, such as the Lenan Shi, a blood-sucking fairy from the Isle of Man, or the Russian Wurdolak, roughly translating to wolf fairy or wolf skin. So as we can see, the subject of vampirism is complex and overlaps with many other phenomena which we have previously explored. Let's try now to parse out what we can, and to do that, as always, we will start from the very beginning. The earliest records of the belief in vampire-like beings can be found in ancient Mesopotamia. One of these was the Edimu, souls of the deceased which roamed the earth, haunting remote and isolated areas. It was said that if a person were to wander into these places, the Edimu would attach itself to the victim and plague them. They could also reach people in their sleep and drain their life force. The spirit could only be dispatched through exorcism, carried out by a priest. Other examples can be found in the Mesopotamian catalog of demons. Listeners of the episode on demons will remember Lamashtu, the blood-sucking demoness who kidnapped children and drank their blood. The translation of an ancient tablet, an incantation meant to banish such entities, reads,
"Spirits that diminish the heaven and earth, that diminish the land, spirits that diminish the land, of giant strength and giant tread, demons like raging bulls, great ghosts, ghosts that break through all houses, demons that have no shame, 7 are they, knowing no care, they grind the land like corn, knowing no mercy, they rage against mankind, they spill their blood like rain, devouring their flesh and sucking their veins. Where the images of the gods are, there they quake. In the temple of Nabu, who fertilize the shoots of wheat, they are demons full of violence, ceaselessly devouring blood. Invoke the ban against them, that they no more return to this neighborhood. By heaven be ye exorcised, by earth be ye exorcised."
The word vampire is thought to be derived from the Serbian word vampira. In Slavic cultures can be found perhaps the most extensive body of folklore regarding vampires, which were at the center of a wave of fear that swept across Southeast Europe, lasting from 1723 to 1735, during which time an alleged vampire epidemic took place. Author Dudley Wright states, "Voltaire was surprised that in the enlightened 18th century, there should still be people found who believe in the reality of vampires, and that the doctors of Sorbonne should give their imprimatur to a dissertation on these unpleasant creatures. From 1700 to 1735, the subject of vampirism formed a principal topic of conversation, and may be said to have been a mania all over the world, with Europe as the particular center. Pamphlets on the subject streamed from the press. The newspapers vied with one another in recording fresh achievements of the specters, and though the philosophers scoffed and ridiculed the belief, sovereigns sent officers and commissioners to report upon their misdeeds. The favorite scenes of their exploits were Hungary, Poland, Silesia, Bohemia, and Moravia, and in those countries a vampire haunted and tormented almost every village. The most prevalent conception of the vampire found throughout most of Europe is a restless human spirit which remained inside the body after death and by some mysterious means was able to reanimate itself and feed on the blood of the living. The negative factors of a person's life which led to this transformation imply that this was a manifestation of a person's discontent, an attempt to gain in death that which they could not in life. Unwilling to move on, driven by intense desire, the person's soul became earthbound and transformed into the monstrosity that was the vampire. This is a similar genesis to the concept of the ghost, except that the vampire managed to retain its physicality to a significant degree. The Sakai people of Perak are attested to have held the belief that vampires were indeed physical beings, as evidenced by their inability to pass through walls or hedges. It was believed that through the act of taking blood from living beings, the vampire was able to preserve and on some level sustain a functioning physical body, serving as a perpetual vessel for the soul and anchor to the physical world. As it was still essentially dead, no longer producing its own vitality, it had to rely on constantly taking it from others in order to exist. Author J. Scoffern wrote, "The best definition I can give of a vampire is a living, mischievous, and murderous dead body. A living dead body. The words are idle, contradictory, and incomprehensible, but so are vampires." 18th century German historian Johann Heinrich Zopfius stated, "Vampires come out of their graves in the nighttime, rush upon people sleeping in their beds, suck out all their blood and destroy them. They attack men, women, and children, sparing neither age nor sex. Those who are under the malignity of their influence complain of suffocation and total deficiency of spirits, after which they soon expire. Some of them asked at the point of death what is the matter with them. Their answer is that such persons lately dead rise to torment them." The vampire drank the blood of its host most commonly by biting the back of the neck, often leaving marks on the victim. They were, however, thought to prey upon people in other ways, such as through strangulation, infliction of disease, or unknown means which were invisible to the eye. In Romania, the phenomenon of sudden death syndrome was directly attributed to them. Vampire beliefs can be found in Grecian lore, and in Crete it was known as the katakand, or vrikolaka in Greece, which is actually Slavic in origin, suggesting it was introduced to Greece from that region. This vampire was a demonic spirit which entered the body of a deceased person and rose to prey on the living, the first of which were the person's relatives. It was said that the vrikolaka would knock on people's doors at night, calling their names and beckoning them to answer. To answer the call and open the door meant certain death. It should be noted that this variation of the vampire may be accounted for by the Greek adoption of Christianity and the subsequent embrace of vampire belief by the Greek Orthodox Church, altered so as to be congruent with their philosophy. It was further adapted by them in maintaining that anyone who was excommunicated would become a vampire and could only be cured through absolution. In other parts of Europe, vampire beliefs were discouraged as superstition by the Church. The vampire is no stranger to the Scandinavians, who, like other Europeans, instituted court processes and special tribunals for handling the issue. Going back further, the vampire is also mentioned in the sagas and other stories of antiquity. One of the more unique tales comes to us from the Danes. One Mithonin, who was famous for his juggling tricks, was quickened, as though by an inspiration from on high, to seize the opportunity of feigning to be a god, and wrapping the minds of the barbarians in fresh darkness, he led them by the renown of his jugglings, to pay holy observance to his name. He said that the wrath of the gods could never be appeased, nor the outrage to their deity expiated by mixed and indiscriminate sacrifices, and therefore forbade that prayers for this end and should be put up without distinction, appointing to each of those above his especial drink offering.
Wine! What are you doing?
It's empty, Your Grace.
What do you mean it's empty?
There's no more wine.
Is that what empty means? Get more.
But when Odin was returning, he cast away all help of jugglings, went to Finland to hide himself, and was there attacked and slain by the inhabitants.
No, please, no!
Even in death, his abominations were made manifest. For those who came nigh to his barrow were cut off by a kind of sudden death, and after his end, he spread such pestilence that he seemed to almost leave a filthier record in his death than in his life. It was as though he would extort from the guilty a punishment for his slaughter. The inhabitants, being in this trouble, took the body out of the mound, beheaded it, impaled it through the breast with a sharp stake, and herein the people found relief. In Germany, the vampire was called the Nachzehrer. It was practiced there to bury food with corpses so that they would not be hungry enough to rise again. In Russia, it was the Vieksi, which first preyed on its family, then neighbors, and also feeding on cattle. At midnight, it was known to climb the belfry and ring the bell, and the sound was an omen of death to all who were unfortunate enough to hear it. Vampire folklore can also be found in many other parts of the world outside of Europe. In India, one of a number of vampiric entities is the Bantu Saburo, a revenant which is said to have power over dogs, luring men into the jungle and using them to run down their prey and drink their blood. In Africa, among the Kafir people, it was said that evil men lived a second time, returning from the grave to plague the living. There are even historical accounts of vampires in China, where similar measures for killing them are recorded, such as burning the body. Another method of the Chinese was to stand watch over a graveyard and wait for the vampire to leave the coffin. then remove the lid so that the air would eventually cause the body to decay. Another method was to throw rice around the grave. The reason for this being that, strangely enough, the vampire had a compulsion to count each piece before proceeding, thus distracting the creature and giving people a chance to destroy it. This same method was used in Russia, except with grain. This OCD characteristic is oddly a motif in vampire folklore. One account states that a family was instructed by a wizard to put a dog outside the door so that the vampire would stop before entering to count every one of its hairs. This obsessive nature of the vampire makes sense within the context of how we understand them to be created, as they are believed to be attached to or obsessed with aspects of earthly life. This behavior is a manifestation of that.
Oh, greetings, it is I, the Count, and it's time to answer that fascinating question, what is the Sesame Street number of the day? Let's count the bats and find out. That's one bat. Two bats. Three fabulous flyers. What? Nothing happened. Where's the confetti? Where's the balloons? Isn't 3 the number of the day? What? Oh, we're not finished counting. 1, 2, 3.
If a recently deceased person was suspected of having become a vampire, it was often customary in Europe for a public inquiry to be held involving the witnesses, and if approved, an exhumation of the grave and examination of the corpse was conducted after 6 or 7 weeks, a period of time at which signs of decomposition could, under normal conditions, be readily observed. Firstly, there were methods of identifying a vampire grave. One sign was to look for the appearance of small holes in the earth, only the width of a finger. Divination could also be used, which in some cases involved having a child ride a horse through a cemetery. If the horse refused to pass over a grave, despite being spurred repeatedly, that grave was believed to be the abode of the vampire. Once the vampire grave had been identified, the body was exhumed and examined for certain characteristics. What were held to be the telltale signs of a vampire included a lack of any decomposition or rigor mortis, as well as a fluidity and freshness to the blood. Quote, "The records state that when such a grave was opened, it was generally found to contain a corpse as fat and handsome as that of a full-blooded man quietly sleeping. The finest vermilion blood would flow from the throat when cut, and this was held to be the blood he had sucked from the veins of living people." Dudley Wright. Sometimes this pilfered blood was observed to be running from the eyes, ears, nose, or mouth. In Polish and Russian lore, it is explained that this occurred when the vampire had consumed so much blood that it could no longer fit inside its body. The modern interpretation of these records is that people of the time did not understand the natural processes of decomposition, the rate of which may slow or accelerate depending on varying environmental conditions, such as temperature. What might be construed as a vampire was in actuality simply a body being preserved by the cold. However, in many cases this explanation is inadequate. 18th century scholar Don Augustin Calmet astutely noted that these perfectly preserved bodies were found among multiple decaying carcasses, dug up at the exact same time. all of which had also been buried at the exact same time, and in some cases, even in the same mound. Once it was determined that a suspect was indeed a vampire, there were a range of methods employed for neutralizing the threat, which often involved putting into place physical restraints and barriers which would prevent the dead from rising from the grave. It was common practice to drive a nail through the skull of a corpse, or place thorny bush stems over it, so that the burial shroud would become snagged and restrain the vampire attempting to rise. Another method was to place heavy stones over the grave, a practice which anthropologist James Frazer identified as the origin of the tombstone. Sometimes magic was utilized as well. Such practices devised to counter evil influences is known as apotropaic magic. Talismans, objects ascribed with religious or magical power, would be placed over graves. One of the most well-known examples of this is the use of garlic, which has been traditionally considered to have purificatory properties, as well as the ability to ward against evil. In the historical region of Transylvania, Romania, the corpse's mouth would be filled with cloves of garlic. This may stem from the belief that a vampire could be created from an evil spirit entering a dead body, and it was a common belief in medieval Europe that they entered a person through the mouth. Indeed, in the Slavic regions, the belief was held that vampires could be created by demonic possession of a corpse, which happened in cases where the person lived a life of malevolence. Another Transylvanian practice, which will no doubt sound familiar, was driving a wooden stake through the body. This appears to have worked on both levels as a physical restraint, pinning the body to the ground, and as a talisman, indicated by the use of certain types of wood, such as ash and hawthorn, believed to be magically potent. A recurring magical symbol used against vampires was the cross. This was invoked in several ways, whether it be through the crossing of the arms of the dead, placing a crucifix upon it, or burying the body at the crossroads. While there is varying symbology behind the cross across cultures, it is universally regarded as representing the nexus between spirit and matter, a point of convergence where multiple forces meet, and thus a spiritually potent liminal threshold between worlds. Perhaps one purpose for the cross was to guide a lost soul to the afterlife by allowing it to cross over, so that it would not linger and become a vampire. A similar idea can be seen in the practice of placing coins with the dead, so that they could pay the toll to cross the river Styx, a body of water in Greek religion which it was believed all souls had to cross in order to reach the land of the dead. For more troublesome cases where perfunctory measures were ineffective, people resorted to the rending and outright destruction of the body, from decapitation to cremation of the heart or the entire body. There are a number of witness accounts that claim that when the bodies were stabbed or dismembered, the vampire, which at first lay still, would suddenly cry out in pain. In 1732, Austrian medical officer Johannes Flukinger reported that the corpse had groaned and bled fresh blood upon being staked. Failure to destroy vampires could have disastrous consequences. The Romanians believed that every person bitten or killed by a vampire known to them as the Nosferatu, would inevitably become one, and that nothing could save them from this fate. People who had their blood sucked in life were considered passive vampires, who then became active, predatory vampires in death. This ability to spread greatly increased their destructive potential in the European mind, being ascribed the ability to multiply and spread in a similar manner to a disease. It was believed that victims who had been attacked must eat dirt from a vampire grave and cover themselves with its blood to avoid becoming one themselves. The following are a series of documented vampire accounts which were attested to by credible witnesses. The first account comes from a 1732 document signed by 3 regimental surgeons and countersigned by 2 lieutenant generals, and tells the story of a village near Belgrade plagued with vampirism. It begins, "In the spring of 1727, there returned from the Levant to the village of Medugna, near Belgrade, one Arnaud Powell, who, in a few years' military service and varied adventure, had amassed enough to purchase a cottage and an acre or 2 of land in his native place, where he gave out that he meant to pass the remainder of his days." It goes on to describe a man known to be of good and steady morals, and affable to all, though he is prone to fits of melancholy. After he becomes betrothed to a village girl, his melancholy increases. Finally, he confides to her the source of his angst. He stated, "It was in Kosovo that this fate befell me. Here you have hitherto escaped the terrible scourge, but there they die, and the dead visit the living. I experienced the first frightful visitation, and I fled, but not till I had sought his grave and executed the dread expiation from the vampire. The man fell from a carriage not long after this, and days later succumbed to his wounds. Stories began circulating of villagers describing being haunted by the deceased, and 4 of them died. The villagers exhumed the man's corpse and found it to be absent of decay and blood on its mouth. The body was burned, as were the bodies of 4 dead villagers, but the vampire plague continued for several years, leading to the creation of the document. In it are the following written accounts. 1. A woman of the name of Stana, 20 years of age, who had died 3 months before, of a 30 days illness following her confinement. She had, before her death, avowed that she had anointed herself with the blood of a vampire to liberate herself from his persecution.
I know he's a vampire.
Nevertheless, she had died. Her body was entirely free from decomposition. On opening it, the chest was found to be filled with recently effused blood, and the bowels had exactly the appearance of sound health. The skin and nails of her hands and feet were loose and came off, but underneath were new skin and nails. 2. A woman of the name of Maisa, who had died at the end of a 3-month illness. The body had been buried 90 and odd days. In the chest was liquid blood. The viscera were, as in the former instance, of normal composition. The body was declared by a Hekate, who recognized it, to be in better condition and fatter than it had been in the woman's legitimate lifetime. 3. The body of a child 8 years old, that had likewise been buried 90 days. It was in the vampire condition. 4. The son of a Hekate, 16 years old. The body had been laying in the grave 9 weeks. He had died after 3 days' indisposition and was in the condition of a vampire. 6. The body of the wife of Hadnuk, buried 7 weeks before, and that of her infant 8 weeks old, buried in only 21 days. They were both in a state of decomposition, though buried in the same ground and closely adjoining the others. The belief in vampires also made its way to the New World, with many documented incidents occurring in the US. New England in particular is rife with vampiric accounts. In fact, Rhode Island was known as the vampire capital of America in the 1800s. Several stories appeared in Yankee magazine of families who lost loved ones to supposed vampires. One tells of a farmer by the name of George Brown who lost his wife, Mary, to a mysterious illness. Only months later, his daughter, Mary Olive, also became ill and died. Over the course of the next several years, George Brown lost another daughter, Mercy, as well as a son, Edwin. Both had been healthy teenagers before their deaths. Villagers began to suspect familial vampirism, and in 1892, they exhumed the bodies of the deceased from their graves in Chestnut Hill Cemetery to discover if this was the case and to kill the vampire or vampires, in hopes of saving Mr. Brown's one remaining son from the same fate. According to the story, quote, "First, the men examined the bodies of Mrs. Brown and the daughter Mary. Finding them to be properly decomposed, they began to exhume Mercy Brown. Slowly, they shoveled into Mercy's grave. When they reached the corpse, they suddenly stepped back in terror. Mercy, who had been buried for more than 2 months, appeared oddly well preserved. It seemed that her hair and nails had grown, and when the men cautiously prodded the corpse with their shovel, they found that it was filled with fresh blood. The suspected vampire's heart was removed and burned on a nearby rock. The ashes were added to young Edwin's medicine. Still, the boy died less than 2 months later. The following is a translation of a Mesopotamian tablet.
The gods which seize upon man have come forth from the grave. The evil wind gusts have come forth from the grave to demand payment of rites and pouring out of libations. They have come forth from the grave. All that is evil in their hosts, like a whirlwind, hath come forth from the grave. The evil spirit, the evil demon, the evil ghost, the evil devil, from earth have come forth. From the underworld unto the land they have come forth. In heaven they are unknown. On earth they are not understood. They neither stand nor sit nor eat nor drink.
In order to understand the true nature of the vampire, it seems necessary to first establish the spiritual mystery of blood itself. What is evident when looking at the archaic religious traditions is that our ancestors universally ascribed deep spiritual significance and power to it. Dudley Wright states, "According to primitive ideas, blood is life, and to receive blood is to receive life. The soul of the dead wants to live, and consequently loves blood. The shades in Hades are eager to drink the blood of Odysseus' sacrifice, that their life may be renewed for a time. It is of the greatest importance that the soul should get what it desires, as if not satisfied, it might come and attack the living. It is possible that bodily mutilations, which to this day accompany funerals among some peoples, have their origins in the belief that the departed spirit is refreshed by the blood thus spilt. In the fairy tale known as Faithful John, the statue containing the soul of the king's servant says to him, "If you will cut off the heads of your 2 children yourself and sprinkle me with their blood, I shall be restored to life." Beyond the souls of the departed, there were also gods who were believed to have a thirst for blood. These were often chthonic deities of the darker aspects of existence, who, while harbingers of death, also cultivated the light within the darkness and reined in the forces of destruction. They were often propitiated in times of great peril and hardship, or to prevent catastrophes from occurring. The Greek goddess Hekate, a deity of the moon, magic, and ghosts, was known to drink blood. She is associated with the crossroads, which we have previously linked to vampires, boundaries, and the doorways between worlds. She is depicted as holding twin torches representing the dual aspects of mercy and severity, shining her light into the underworld. She was also invoked as a protector, as she held power over all unruly and wicked spirits. Known to be a psychopomp with the ability to travel between worlds, she served as a guide and ally to Persephone after her abduction by Hades. The ancient Egyptians worshipped a female warrior goddess named Sekhmet, whose name means "she who is powerful." A goddess of chaos, war, and healing, depicted with the body of a woman and the head of a lion wearing a sun disk. A deity of terrible power, she was both feared and revered. She is sometimes referred to in Egyptian texts as "she before whom evil trembles," or "the mistress of the dead," or "the lady of slaughter." According to Egyptian text, Sekhmet's father, Ra, sent her to punish humans for their disobedience. During her exploits, she developed a taste for the sanguine, drinking the blood of her victims. This developed into an insatiable thirst. Her father, in an effort to stop her from destroying humanity, dyed a large quantity of ale red. Sekhmet, duped into thinking it to be blood, drank her fill and was inebriated, which apparently settled her, and she returned home peacefully. Every year on the Feast of Sekhmet, Egyptians commemorated the saving of mankind by drinking copious amounts of beer stained with pomegranate juice. The Mayans, known for their prolific engagement in human sacrifice, considered blood as nourishment to the gods. Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés, upon arriving at the Aztec capital, witnessed a ceremony wherein a priest, using an obsidian blade, sliced open the chests of a number of sacrificial victims, removing their still beating hearts to be given as an offering. The temple was described as having 2 rounded towers made up of thousands of human skulls. It was believed that the god Huitzilopochtli had to be fed with human hearts and blood to keep the sun moving across the sky. The god was believed to be fighting a constant battle against the forces of darkness, which could only be sustained through human sacrifice. They believed that if they failed to do this, that it would mean their total destruction. The Mayan god of death, Camazotz, depicted with the head of a bat, was said to emerge from the underworld through a cave. He would then descend upon the people, grabbing his victims by the neck and decapitating them to feast on their blood. Legend has it that this god was the reason human sacrifice came to be practiced among the Mayan people. Aside from spirits and gods, humans were not unknown to seek the power of blood. It was thought in some ancient cultures to have revivifying and healing properties. Blood was also used in magical practice to enhance the powers of the practitioner or the working itself. Australian indigenous sorcerers believed that an initiatory consumption of bloody human flesh gave them their ability. It was also thought to have been consumed in ritual and religious context, specifically in communion with gods. Scholars have suggested that there were secret cults devoted to Hekate, which practiced blood drinking, even though the practice was outlawed in Greek society. Her patrons likely propitiated her for seeking the secrets of the spiritual worlds and of magic. One of her titles was fittingly the Keeper of the Keys. There are cases across history where blood was used as a medical treatment for a variety of ailments, from plague to epilepsy to melancholy. Medieval physicians prescribed baths of human blood. At the end of the 15th century, a dying Pope Innocent VIII was fed blood rendered from 3 young men in an attempt to restore his health. The use of blood to treat sickness was part of a broader category of medicine, often referred to as corpse medicine, which involved the use of flesh and bone as well, though blood was deemed to be the elixir of life. Many recipes described elaborate and often gruesome steps to curate blood for the optimal benefit of the patient. In the 1860s, French biologist Paul Bert conducted experiments in which he surgically joined albino rat pairs, resulting in a shared bloodstream. Bert's groundbreaking work earned him the prize of experimental physiology of the French Academy of Science in 1866. However, the medical community lost interest in the subject until the early 1900s, when scientists, fascinated by the physiological symbiosis of Siamese twins, revisited Bert's work. His procedure was refined and the technique was termed parabiosis. Throughout the 1900s, scientists used the technique to study a variety of human conditions, including diabetes, hypertension, and obesity. But it was not until the last 2 decades that the focus turned to aging and regeneration. In 2016, a Stanford medical graduate used the theory of parabiosis to create a company marketing blood transfusions from young donors to combat and reverse the aging process. The company was named Ambrosia, referring to the ambrosia of Greek mythology, which was said to have the power to bestow immortality. While the company protects the confidentiality of its clients, there was no shortage of elite customers willing to pay the exorbitant $8,000 price for a single transfusion and shot at the fountain of youth. Silicon Valley giants continue to invest billions into biotech companies researching the anti-aging properties of young blood. Blood is a very special fluid. Faust, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. What is it about blood that people believed it to be such an important part of spirituality and so coveted by spirits and gods? Its life-sustaining properties on a biological level are well known. The most important function of blood is taking oxygen from the lungs, rendering it bioavailable and distributing it throughout the body. It is commonly expressed in religion that man was given life by the breath of God, and blood, being the carrier of breath, is the link between the outside source and the inner being. This body of belief seems to suggest that blood not only holds great spiritual power, but is somehow a link between matter and spirit. We will now explore this idea further from a spiritual, occult perspective, suspending our disbelief and approaching the possibility of vampirism as a genuine phenomenon. According to Austrian esoteric philosopher Rudolf Steiner, there are three distinct bodies within man that together constitute his entire being. The physical body, the etheric body, etheric referring to the fine spiritual matter in between physical and spiritual, and lastly, the astral, or entirely spiritual body. Man begins as pure consciousness and forms these successively denser bodies as he comes into earthly manifestation. Each of these, in turn, organize and are linked to certain systems within the physical body. Without these links, the physical body is essentially lifeless. It is when the astral body develops that we see the manifestation of the individual ego. Steiner explains, "We have seen how the external formless substances enter the human body, and how the etheric body turns these substances into living forms. How further, the astral body fashions pictures of the external world. How this reflection of the external world resolves itself into inner experiences, and how this inner life then reproduces from within itself pictures of the outer world. When this metamorphosis extends to the etheric body, blood is formed." In other words, the sum of each person's experience, and thus their whole identity as it has developed throughout their life, is imprinted on the blood. Therefore, blood is the physical expression of the individual. This idea is not without anecdotal evidence, as we see the phenomenon of organ and blood recipients taking on the personality traits and memories of their donors. This encoding of the blood transcends the individual. The information stored within it is carried on through lineage. According to Steiner, ancestral experience, wisdom, and morality are all inherited through the blood. Furthermore, in the early days of humanity, blood was not mingled beyond the tribe. And this pure blood gave man exceptional abilities such as clairvoyance. When people began commingling blood through exogamy or marrying outside of the tribe, these abilities were lost. This idea is no doubt connected to royal families and their historical preoccupation with the preservation of pure bloodlines. Because blood is inherently tied to identity, quote, "It is that about which the real fight must be waged when it comes to the struggle concerning man between good and evil. The myths and legends tell of these things. They say, that which has power over thy blood has power over thee. Whatever power it is that wishes to obtain the mastery over a man, that power must work upon him in such a way that the working is expressed in his blood." This is the deep and spiritual meaning of the quotation from Faust. This is why the representative of the evil principle says, "Sign thy name to the pact with thy blood. If once I have thy name written in thy blood, then I can hold thee by that which above all sways a man. Then I shall have drawn thee over to myself,